want to welcome all of you out there to this discussion on one of the intangible topics that we have not been following. Topics that keep rising for all the 300 years since the British came to rule us. I am Andile M-Afrika, Dr. Andile M-Afrika, and I'm speaking from my home, King Williamstown. This topic is about my hometown. It is now entitled British Kaffraria, a crown colony built on African blood. I want to kick off our discussion with a quotation on the establishment of this little town by a governor called Sir Benjamin Durban on the 10th of May, 1835. This is what Durban said. Here on the fertile banks of this clear, rapid, and beautiful stream, and upon ground admirably fitted by nature for the purpose of a provincial town, the Commander-in-Chief has fixed the site of one and named it by a general order of this day, King William's Town. This statement was the official declaration of my hometown as a capital of a crown colony that the British were creating. First named the Queen of Adelaide Province, after the wife of King William IV, and later the British Kaffraria, in other words, the land of Kaffers. British settlers were establishing themselves after conquering and expelling what they termed hostile Xhosa from their land between the Kiskama River and the Kai River, an area of 7,000 square miles. Lester writes in his book about this declaration in these words: Queen Adelaide Province became the first British attempt to extend direct rule over a large body of formerly independent and definitely hostile Africans. No such ambitious scheme had ever been attempted before in Southern Africa, and no such scheme would even be seriously contemplated elsewhere in Africa until the late 19th century. So for all my conscious life in this town, living in my two-roomed, ceilingless and concrete-floored home at the end of a flight of stairs, interchanging this permanent enclosure with a tiny one-windowed pit called Seven Scotters, wherever my mother worked, I have never rested, seeing all the traces of brute colonialism and its stinking breath of white racism. Even after so many blinks of my eyes, the experience of oppression and its companion, the extraction of the labor and sweat of my people, history has always demanded my attention. Is this not caused by the restlessness of the spirits of my people who sought to defend my land against the concerted attacks of the invading race, the British? That today I am confronted by a landscape that still tells me in a straight and forward manner that Africans, after all the wars, are strangers in their environment. That even when the wars of land dispossession had passed and the new ones had come, we remain strangers in our own land. Strangers who are as devastated as we were when General Jomsobomvu Makoma was sent to Robben Island for the first time. Because to this day, we do not have any power to reshape our environment. so that that environment can speak to us as African beings. Not to mention the absence on our part of the mentality to pursue such a dream. But we rest on the words of Professor Eskia Mphahlele when he writes in his book that, I quote, "We do not talk of history as if we were merely engaged in philosophical contemplation of events or a general discourse on the human condition. We feel history's pulse, the place that contains it as it happens on us and as we ourselves happen to time and place and circumstance. If it flows like a river, then we ride it, swim its waters, try to keep afloat. We feel it wash past and over us, often leaving us holding its debris in our hands. In other words, history is concrete experience. We seek to comprehend it as cause, effect, aftermath, and set of resonances." There was a conference convened in Berlin, now famously known as the Berlin Conference of 1884, where Europe decided to curve Africa among herself so that many years later we can talk of French Africa, Portuguese Africa, English Africa, and so forth. There must have been a conference somewhere in Britain. For now, let us call it the London Conference, where Britain decided to curve my homeland, the land where my home is, into white farms and white farm towns named after the invading race. The Berlin Conference was preceded by wars across the continent of Africa. Europeans were beginning to fight among themselves over the fertile lands of Africa. They needed to come together and address their common interest. Those being, one, to enslave Africans, to oppress Africans, to exploit Africans, and to dispossess Africa. The London Conference, my own creation, since the colonial office was based in London, had also come on the heels of bruising wars. The English were not only going to enslave, oppress, exploit, and dispossess amaXhosa, they wanted to settle themselves on the land of my people. There were many clashes with the invading British. These fights are characterized in Western history as frontier wars. Why? Because for the British, wherever they sought to conquer land belonging to others, the word frontier has always been used to mean a borderline. The implication here is that a conflict between two or more landowners over a contested piece of land. Now, at the beginning of the wars on land dispossession, my land, that have totaled more than 200 clashes, the British, the invaders of the lands of African people, would have confiscated some parts of our land and would therefore view themselves as the new owners. Listen to Colonel Harry Smith when he explains their understanding of dispossessing Africans of their land. These are words from Smith's mouth. Conquest establishes the right of possession. Are the Kaffars, the possessors of this soil by right of conquest, not to be ejected by the same right? Are they alone of all the rest of the aborigines from whom England has wrested her possessions to be thus favored? These Xhosas are irreclaimable savages whose extermination would be a blessing. Close quote. To demonstrate the extent of the resolve of the British in expropriating the lands of amaXhosa, they built military installations. They helped build missionary stations and other European cultural institutions. Here are the military installations that the British built around my home. The Fort Hill, it is here in King Williamstown. Post Victoria, it's near Alice. It was built in 1844 by Governor Sir Peregrine Maitland. Fort Hare, named after Lieutenant Colonel John Hare. Fort White, after Major T.C. White, built in 1835. Fort Murray, after George Murray, built in 1847. Fort Paddy, after Colonel Paddy, in 1835. Fort Cox, after Major William Cox. Fort Montgomery, after Lieutenant Montgomery Williams. Fort Waterloo, built in 1860. Fort Stokes, built in 1846. Eland's Post near Seymour, after Colonel C.F. Seymour. A camp in the mountains established by Colonel Henry Somerset in 1846 in Kiskamawuk, Uqoboqobo. Fort Glamorgan in East London. For the christening project of AmaXhosa, they deployed the following institutions and individuals. The London Missionary Society, LMS, with Reverend Frederick Kaiser at Knapp's Hope and Reverend John Brownlee here in King Williamstown. Glasgow Missionary Society, GMS, with William Chalmers and Robert Niven at Cume, James Lang at Ben's Hill, John Ross at Piri, John Benny at Lovedale, James Ware and Alexander McDermott, who were artisans. Wesleyan Methodists, WMMS, with John Shepstein at Wesleyville, William Boyce at Mount Cook, and John Aliff in Paddy. Later, there was the South African Missionary Museum, which was established in a building that was constructed in 1855 as a Wesleyan chapel here in King Williamstown. For real permanence and in support of the institutions that they were establishing, the British built stone prisons to punish and demoralize resistance. They built hospitals to thwart and kill the indigenous health systems. They built in their capital, King Williamstown, what Governor Sir Harry Smith called a great kraal, where annual meetings were held and presents such as plows and clothes were given with words of warning being directed to those viewed as evil doers. At some point, a museum called the Kaffraria Museum was founded by a group called King Williamstown Natural Society in 1884. A library was built in 1877. A post office was opened in the same year. So you can hear and see, this is a story of British governors, British sirs, the commissioners, high and low, the Christian missionaries and their societies, members of parliament in Britain and in Cape Town, politicians, bureaucrats in the colonial office in London, European settlers, travelers and merchants. It is a story of Governor Durban, Governor McLean, Governor Smith, Governor Cathcart, and of course, Governor George Grey. The whole takeover was ruthless. Whites were out to humiliate blacks. They enjoyed ridiculing the black leadership. Let us look at the two governors, Smith and George Grey, in order to appreciate the extent of the ruthlessness of the British. In 1835, during the War of the Axe, Imfazwe Yezembe, AmaXhosa were led by Unkosi Usandile, who in 1847 was tricked into imprisonment through a phony invitation to negotiations to end the war. When he arrived in Grahamstown for so-called negotiations with his delegation, they were immediately locked up. In December 1834, Governor Sir Harry Smith, whatever that honor means to us, the conquered race, arrived in the Eastern Cape on a ship that docked at Port Elizabeth. Smith had been knighted after a stint in India. He had a doctoral degree from Cambridge University. This was his second coming to South Africa. Earlier, he had commanded British troops during the 6th Land Dispossession War between 1834 and 1835. In that war, Smith killed Unkosi Uyitsa. By mischievously inviting Unkosi Uyitsa into peace negotiations in his camp. During his arrival in PE, Smith was welcomed by the general of AmaXhosa armies, General Jongomsobomvu Maqoma. Instead of accepting the honor from a senior figure in the leadership of AmaXhosa, Smith drew his sword and made a gesture of attack towards General Maqoma, with his white crowd approvingly laughing loud. At his hotel, he invited General Maqoma and ordered him to his knees. He placed his boot on Maqoma's neck and said, "This is to teach you that I am come hither to show AmaXhosa that I am chief and master here." Later, it got to be reported that General Maqoma responded by saying, "You are a dog, and so you behave like a dog. This thing, you, was not sent by Victoria, who knows that I am of royal blood like herself." Smith went on to Grahamstown, where Unkosi Sandile was held. Brandishing a gun, he told Sandile that he was the great chief, a chief of all chiefs. And when he was satisfied that he had made his statement, he then ordered that Sandile be released. He proceeded to King Williamstown. Smith ordered all the royal leaders of AmaXhosa to be brought before him. He humiliated them publicly, shamboked them on the buttocks, sat on a horse, and ordered that they kiss his boot one by one. Nkosi Sandile did not attend that meeting. Commissioner Brownlee was sent to fetch Sandile. Sandile refused. Smith declared that Sandile was no longer Inkosi yamaXhosa. In his place, Brownlee was declared the new chief. Smith confiscated the land that Sandile presided over between Fish River and Kiskama River, the present-day Pedi area. So with the expropriation of the land between the Kiskama and the Kai rivers, and it being named the British Kaffraria, with a martial law declared, another war was in the coming, the War of Mlanje. George Grey is another interesting character. He came to South Africa in 1854 to become the governor of the Cape Colony. Between 1841 and 1845, Grey was a governor of Australia, and between 1845 and 1854, he was a governor of New Zealand. So South Africa, and Eastern Cape in particular, was the apex of Grey's colonial governorship. My home was where he would prove his lasting legacy in treating the conquered. 2 years after his arrival, we experienced the Nongqawuse catastrophe. On his third year, he was settling military veterans of the Anglo-German Legion in my homeland, and women who were classified as unmarried Irish women who were on a ship that wrecked in East London called Lady Kennaway. For more on this, you can Google articles Lady Kennaway, Earl Grey Famine Orphans, or you can Google shipwrecks of Buffalo City. The Grey Hospital in King Williamstown was built by George Grey in 1859 to civilize amaXhosa. He brought Dr. Fitzgerald, an Irish medical doctor, to be the first doctor in this hospital. Fitzgerald, in praising Grey, said these words, "You know, it was my strong affection for you which made me throw up my position in Wellington to follow you here. And when you left, I would have gone back to New Zealand if I could. The Irish heart does not forget kindness, and such kindness and honor as you showed me." Grey was to earn a lot of more praises for taking over our lands. Merivalt, who's quoted by Mostert in his book titled Frontiers, says about Grey, "We must remember that we have entrusted these affairs to a man of singular and proved ability in dealing with savage races. If he succeeds in this experiment, he will have accomplished what none of his predecessors ever dreamt of." It was also under Grey's time when General Maqoma and other senior personnel in the armies of amaXhosa, such as Siolo and Xhoxho, when they were arrested, sentenced, and sent to the Robben Island prison in 1858. After serving 9 years there, they were all released in 1867. In 1877, Siolo and Xhoxho, who had rejoined the war after their imprisonment, they died during the 9th War of Land Dispossession. But before that, General Maqoma had been rearrested and resent to the Robben Island prison in 1871. The British, in other words, were well prepared to conquer and own our lands. They started by imposing their identity on our landscape. They proclaimed the British Kaffraria. They named our territories after Cambridge, Yorkshire, Middlesex, Lincoln, Province of Victoria, Beaufort, Albany, Somerset, Northumberland, and Sussex. They established farm towns and called them Berlin, Frankfurt, Hanover, Stutterheim, London, King Williamstown, Grahamstown, Queenstown, Alice, Adelaide, Hamburg. I can go on and on and on. Of these, Grey saw the need to settle his own people. This naming exercise of the British is reflected upon by a Kenyan professor, Professor Ngugi Watuwongo, in a recorded interview when he said, in 1585, a well-known English poet called Spenser, a contemporary of Shakespeare, wrote a book called A View of Ireland at the present time. This book is a conversation between a visiting English lord from England and an English settler in Ireland. What were they discussing? Why have we not been able to conquer the Irish? How can we do it? They came up with one thing: names. If we can destroy their naming system, how they name themselves, they will soon forget who they are. The establishment of the British Kaffraria is a story whose twin stories were born with the same measure of pain around the same period, the 19th century, in the following areas around the world: India in the east, so-called British North America, today's US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and closer home, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Mozambique, Angola, all these being settler-type colonies created by the British. So British Kaffraria is a story of European penetration into the African home, using two crucial tools, the gun and the Bible, in an intrusion that would leave Africans powerless, permanently bruised, and without dignity. we have to come into terms with the burden of our history. I'm a descendant of a people who were conscious of a force that is supreme over themselves and the nature around, a force that resides kwiziziba of our rivers, at the foot of our mountains, within the life of our animals, a force ever present around. I belong to a people who respect nature and who admit to the might of natural forces around them. I'm a grandchild of a people who were and still are in love with their lands because they have long merged with their environment. A people who are one with their rivers, one with their mountains, their forests, and of course, with their vegetable and animal worlds. So to me, this is a story of resistance, a story of how a foreign memory was planted in the place of the indigenous memory, a story of being owned, being a British crown colony, a story of a generation that was dismembered from its base, that now seeks to reconnect with its memory in order to engage with the world in a fruitful and meaningful way. British Kaffraria, to me, is a story of being defined, being classified as 1, the disputed figure, 2, the unpredictable object predisposed to irrational acts of violence, 3, objects to be located, ordered, and disciplined, and be put in line at minimum expense. British Kaffraria is a story of British fantasy of control, held in position through a network of cars on sea. They are ships that carried instructions in between Britain and her colonies, reports in the form of dispatches, letters, newspapers, along with the loot from the colonies that include prized human heads of African kings. Control, subdue through white magistrates, use defeated African leaders to oversee British rule, supervise them through resident agents, and whenever necessary, declare martial law. So ours now is to find our memory in order to understand our today and our tomorrow. We need Ben Ogri, who would advise us in his words, everything we need to know is concealed in everything we take for granted. I need to repeat this. Everything we need to know is concealed in everything we take for granted. Perhaps this was a way of preparing us Africans for total assimilation, wherein we would be completely uprooted, we would be directionless, and therefore we would chase Western thoughts of rainbow nation, having been clipped of our Africanness. Our rose to the crawl, the sanctuary of our ancestors, our original mentors, would be blocked and unreachable because of the inculcated confusion. Even when the voices of our ancestors seek to whisper and reach us now and then, the white man's image that we have assimilated would close us off. I see a ghost moving about freely in my homeland. Many who come into this area get shocked to realize that even at a time when Impepo would have been burnt and all evil spirits chased out, this representative imprint of the British colonial empire relaxes comfortably on a piece of land it confiscated 3 centuries ago. The worst part of the permanent takeover is the unquestioned, internalized foreign identities that has graduated itself into a toy gun in the small and minute and distasteful territorial battles within the conquered race. Come over to King Williamstown, you will see how hard they hit their chests, emphasizing their pride for being the uninvited stepchildren of Franz Ginsberg, a white, shrewd member of a local white council who happened to impose his name over Africans settled here. Ask them why they insist in calling themselves Ginsberg boys and girls. You will hear them say, we just like it, nothing further. Even a dog that was tied to a chain and had not realized that it had been unchained, at some point it will test its freedom. I am aware that today we are living in uninspiring times. The same nature that surrounds me has ceased to be the independent entity that mesmerizes by its mysteries. I'm in a time that has severed the rhythmic connection human beings, my people, had with nature. Today, the birth of a plant and an animal, which for all the time was my birth, is no longer mine. The death of that plant and that animal, which for all the time was my death, is now no longer mine. When nature suffered, it was my suffering. I do not feel nostalgic over nature any longer. Finally, in finding these truths among the things we take for granted, let us hold Mpahlele's words with conviction that to us, history is not a mere engagement in philosophical contemplation of events or a general discourse on human condition. History has a pulse, has a place that contains itself as it happens on us and as we ourselves happen to time, place, and circumstance. If history flows like a river, then we ride it, then we swim its waters, and we try to keep afloat. We feel it wash past and over us, often leaving us holding its debris in our hands. For us, the British Kaffraria as an experiment is a concrete experience. We have to comprehend this as cause, effect, aftermath, and set of resonances. This is the beginning. It's the beginning of a long journey to restore African dignity so that we can engage with the world in a fruitful and meaningful way.